Hello everyone, Mouse98 here with a brand new video. Today we're doing a review on the piece The National Question by J.V. Stalin. Now this piece was actually in a book called The Foundations of Leninism, which is actually by Joseph Stalin, which I recommend you read if you're into Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. It's a very important piece in Marxist literature in general, and it's a very good book to understand, build your foundations on Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. It's short and it's easy to read, and I highly recommend it. Now, it's important to know that Stalin had separated this into two parts. Part A, he goes over the question that is presented, and Part B is where he actually talks about the national liberation of the oppressed people along with the proletariat. So I'll do the same, except I'll add a third part, which will be my thoughts as per usual. So yeah, that's what's going to happen, and let's begin. So in the first part, he goes over on how the original question had a different meaning, and how the question itself changed over time with the help of Leninism. He goes over on how the Second International only considered the national liberation of European races, such as the Irish, Serbians, Hungarians, and Finnish, and they did want freedom, but the issue Stalin pointed out was that it was only focused on Europe and not on the Asiatic or African peoples. He states, what I assume to be his disgust, is on how the International kept calling the European oppressed people civilized and uncivilized, and how they would never say that about the Asiatic or African peoples, because at that time I guess they didn't really care. But however, as time went on, it became much more than the liberation of European oppressed people, but also the liberation of all people who suffered from the slavery of imperialism. He gives an example on how the Second International, that self-determination then only meant cultural autonomy, while still having, the ruling nation still have the political power, which clearly was not a good idea. Cultural freedom isn't the same as political freedom. Now, of course, thanks to Leninism, the term self-determination had undergone a transformation. It had a new meaning now. What once was considered to be reformism, yes, believe it or not, self-determination used to be considered reformism, became a new form of revolutionary idea, as Leninism had now considered to be the national liberation of oppressed people to be useful and vital to overthrow the oppressing class. Now, Stalin does state that just because we support the idea of the oppressed people to overthrow the oppressor doesn't mean we support every single one of them. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, for example, let's say there's a group that is capitalists, and they want to overthrow their oppressors. Now, back then, if we were talking about like a monarchy or a foreign power imposing the will, say like how England or the king of Egypt oppose their will on the Arab people in Egypt, we would still say support Nasser, despite the fact that he wasn't really socialist but more quasi and just more capitalist. We would still support him because he wanted this self-determination for his people. We would support that. And if there was still a feudalist country around, we would support, the capitalist power when to overthrow the feudalist power, because, well, that's logical. You can't have, socialism until you have a state of capitalism. So, of course, we would support that's the only time we'd support the capitalist class to overthrow, something that's not really beneficial to anyone. It has to get the gears turning. Now, perfect examples in real life would be something to say like the Soviet-Afghan War. And if people that are Marxist-Leninists start taking offense when I say, be against the Soviet-Afghan War, well, the thing is, yes, America used Osama bin Laden and what would be right-wing terrorists later down the line in Afghanistan, but the Soviet Union at that time was no saint. By that time, they're full-blown capitalists. They're full damn revisionist. So I would say don't support either side. There's even a group of Mao Zedong thought people in Afghanistan that opposed both, and sadly, since there weren't that many of them, they didn't get their voices heard. Another example would be, of course, the Hong Kong protesters. Yes, China is a capitalist revisionist hellhole, but Hong Kong is literally asking for the aid of America and wanting to return back to the days under British rule. They are reactionary people, asking help for another reactionary force. You don't support either one of them, because either way you're partaking in reactionary thought and thus then self-defeating yourself. You're not helping left-wing causes, but you're just making right-wing causes even stronger, whether you realize it or not. Alright, I'm going to skip over to the last paragraph of part A to read this quote he ends off with. Quote, Lenin was right in saying that the national movement of the oppressed countries should be appraised not from the point of view of formal democracy, but from the point of view of the actual results, as shown by the general balance sheet of the struggle against imperialism. That is to say, not in the isolation, but on a whole world scale. That's quite a consequentialist outlook. I do say so myself. Alright, now the second part is where he actually goes over the importance of national liberation and how it can be useful. Okay, but however, so this motherfucker ended up putting, C-split shit into camps, and it's so long that I did not feel like typing it, so my lazy ass is gonna read it from the book itself. Hold on. Okay, it's A through J. Let's get this shit over with. The world is divided into two camps. The camp of a handful of civilized nations which possess finance, capital, and exploit the vast majority of the population of the globe, and the camp of the oppressed and exploited peoples and the colonies and dependent countries which constitute the majority. The colonies and the dependent countries oppressed and exploited by finance, capital constitute a vast reserve and a very important source of strength for imperialism. See, the revolutionary struggle of the oppressed people in the dependent and colonial countries against imperialism is the only road that leads to their emancipation from oppression and exploitation. D. The most important colonial and dependent countries have already taken the path of the national liberation movement, which cannot but lead to the crisis of world capitalism. E. The interests of the proletariat movement in the developed countries and of the national liberation movement in the colonies call for the union of these two forms of the revolutionary movement into a common front against the common enemy, against imperialism. F. The victory of the working class in developed countries in the liberation of the oppressed peoples from the yoke of imperialism are impossible without the formation and the constellation of a common revolutionary front. G. The formation of a common revolutionary front is impossible unless the proletariat of the oppressor nations renders direct and determined support to the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples against imperialism of its own country, for, he quotes Engels here, no nation can be free from if it oppresses other nations. So, America. H. This support implies the upholding, defense, and the implementation of the slogan of the right of nations to secession and to independent existence as states. I. Unless this slogan is implemented, the union and the collaboration of nations within a single world economic system, which is the material basis for the victory of world socialism, cannot be brought about. And J. The union can only be voluntary, arising on the basis of mutual confidence and fraternal relations among the people. Yeah, A through J, and that was not fun. Okay, so after this, Stalin makes a great point that imperialism has a contradiction within it, for imperialism must exploit their colonies and retain them by force, and they usually do this the most ass way possible when it comes to the native people. Let's look at Africa, for example. The Western European countries formed the African colonies by forcing the tribes that either already didn't like each other or butchering their land and organizations for the sake of, using them for their own wealth. Nigeria is a perfect example. You have my people, the Yoruba, the Nupe, the Hausa, the Igbo, and Fulani, who were forced to be clustered together despite their history with each other. The Brits did not give a damn. There cannot be a peaceful way to have colonies, and these people will eventually rise up and fight against the oppressor, as we have seen throughout history. Now, Stalin also brings up the issue of chauvinism in the countries that have it at the time, and pretty much still today, that, if they call themselves socialists but won't fight their government, it will most likely sell out. He goes on to say that if it weren't for the support of the oppressed people around the world, the Russian Revolution would have failed, and that the Soviet Union that had existed now, or then pretty much, wouldn't have the autonomous republics/regions, so each ethnic group could govern themselves and have their own freedom from Russian imperialism. America at the time, and even today, didn't do that. Hell, most Marxists then only cared for white liberation and not black and First Nation liberation. That wouldn't be until the 60s and 70s when political ideas such as New Africa, Ausland, First Nation, and other autonomous regions that emphasized the importance of self-determination amongst oppressed groups. Sadly, today, most Marxists don't even think about that anymore in fear of identity politics, which they misunderstand, and other forms of perceived racism, when in reality they either haven't read Lenin or Stalin. Stalin also mentions how America is, or at the time, was known for its isolationism, which I doubt that we ever were, but at that time we weren't as active in imperialism as we are now. He states that isolationism is not a good way to fight imperialism, as it alienates itself from helping the oppressed people internationally. At the end, before he quotes Lenin, Stalin states that the masses must be educated on internationalism in order to help show solidarity to oppressed people against their oppressor. So, yeah, that was on the national question, but what are my thoughts? This piece is a good piece. This is the 70% good that Mao meant when he was talking about Stalin. Stalin helped further Leninisms in that case on the right of self-determination and national liberation. He helped show that if there is to be freedom, there must be freedom for the oppressed nationalities, and their political autonomy is to be seen as legitimate. He explains why the idea of cultural autonomy is not enough. He explains why solidarity is important and why isolationism just doesn't work. It just doesn't. This is an important read for all leftists, whether you be Maoist, Leninist, Hojist, anarchist, syndicalist, or just a starter leftist, a baby leftist as they call it. This read is important and can help you with the understanding of national liberations of oppressed nationalities. Well, anyway, that's my video for now. I don't have anything planned yet. I'm thinking about going over a piece in the Black Panther book that I have, but I don't know. But I might make one more video. I don't go back to school until near the end of January. We got like a 6-week break. So, yeah, if you liked the video, like it. If you dislike it, you disliked it. Comment, subscribe, give me a critique. If you have any questions, feel free to post them. Any recommendations, that's fine. I probably won't take it, but if you want, and have a happy holidays, everyone. And this is Mouse98 signing off.